Hey everybody, thanks for showing up to our virtual crosswalk worship experience. I hope you're doing okay this week. We have a good one for you today, I think. You're going to hear an update first from our friends over in Nairobi, Kenya. We've been supporting a project over there, a school for the poorest of the poor in one of the worst slums in the world outside of Nairobi, Kenya, called Huruma. And Faraha Community Center looks for the children who are most at risk in that community and gives them an education which makes all the difference, not just for them, but for their families as well. And so an update for them, we started off our partnership with them by providing food for every kid. That was over 500 kids every school day, which made a world of difference. We ended up feeding over the time that we were investing in that over 1 million meals, which is just mind-blowing. And now we're more project centered with their program over there. And we got to get behind a wonderful project to get them up and running, given COVID issues in Kenya for this school year. So you'll get to see what that did, which is profound and very much needed. As one who's visited that place 5 times, I can tell you these were much needed improvements, and so glad we're able to do that for those kids. And then also just a heads up, we're having communion at the end of the teaching today. So if you want to grab yourself a Twinkie and some Kool-Aid or whatever elements you've got to put your hands on, it just needs to be something to eat and something to drink, and we'll make it work. Then go grab those before the end of the service, or hit pause and go take care of that now, and I'll lead you through that after the teaching. New series kicks off today. I'll explain more about that when it's time for the teaching. And there's a song before we do communion as well, rather than at the beginning of our time together, because it will set us up for communion and the Lord's Prayer. So, without further ado, let's get going. See you at the end.
Happy New Year, Crosswalk Community Church. My name is David Oginga, Executive Director for our Community Foundation. I want to wish you a year full of blessing, prosperity, and great opportunity in all your endeavors. On 4th of January, we are receiving our students back, and we are so excited to have them come back into an environment that has been improved. It's because of your support and your generous contribution that we've been able to improve the ambience of our facility.
This is not how we were before, and I can see we are very happy with the way the school is looking like. We are very confident that kids are coming back on a very clean and sparkling place with happy faces too, I think, because what we are having in the premise is one that is bringing a lot of fun to kids and also would help them. You know, they have gone through difficulties at home, and this could bring back their joy. And in the process, we are hopeful that they will learn with a lot of ease.
The classes are looking so nice. The environment is looking so great. This is a sign of a future or a year of hopefulness that we want to nurture in our students. We want them to come back with excitement and ready to learn.
Thank you for your continued support. May Almighty God bless you. In Jesus' name.
Thank you so much, Crosswalk Community Church, for your continued generous contribution. Your love, your support, your prayers has always been a pillar for our community. We are looking forward to having you being part of our journey in the next year ahead. God bless you.
So I've been thinking a lot about this series that I'm going to take us on over the next few weeks, throughout February at least, and maybe extend beyond that. We'll see. But the reason I wanted to do it was because I think it's extremely relevant for our time right now. February is an interesting month because several things converge at the same time. The first thing growing up in my family context that I thought about with February was that's when Valentine's Day hits. And it's that day on February 14 where we're supposed to show extra love to, our loved ones in our household or whatever, or key relationships, that kind of a thing. It's generally on the romance side. I remember as a little kid in elementary school, that was a day to look forward to because, I got a lot of candy that day because everybody knew at that time you were supposed, even if you didn't like people, you were supposed to give every kid in class some little goofy card for Valentine's Day. Even if you didn't, like I said, care about them whatsoever, they were at least going to get this card saying Happy Valentine's Day. And if you were lucky, you got some sweet tarts with it, or those little heart message things that were pretty good. Maybe, Hershey's Kisses or something like that. You might take a risk on that day and tell somebody, that you were maybe more than friends. I don't know. But anyway, that was kind of part of it. But then also in our country, we have some holidays, or at least one holiday called President's Day that we celebrate. And that's because Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12. George Washington was born somewhere in February, I can't remember right now. And also, so we get a Monday off, February 15 this year as President's Day. So you get that Monday off from work to go skiing or do some chores or what have you. But also in our history, and kind of related, Frederick Douglass was born on February 14. And so we have President's Day. We also have Black History Month, which is celebrated all throughout February. And Frederick Douglass, of course, was a primary voice for equal rights, post-emancipation in particular, and was a leading voice globally on this issue and was widely read and respected. So these things all come together. Love, our nation's history, Black culture, Black history, how we understand that in our nation's history, and they coalesce. And it's relevant today because we're still dealing with some of these issues that, according to some of our founding documents in our country, should have been resolved like from the very beginning. And yet they're still with us. We talk about these truths being self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. And yet there are a lot of voices and a lot of our own history that suggest otherwise. And so I want to talk about that. And then from a deeper standpoint, back in our religious tradition, our faith tradition, we're Jesus followers at Crosswalk. We are a Christian church, even though we are very inclusive and respect other faith traditions and honor them appropriately. But we're a Jesus tradition, which means we're also born from a deeper root, Jesus's root, which was the Jewish tradition. And so I want to take a look at how they dealt with this stuff, and Jesus in particular, which we're going to look at kind of an uncomfortable, surprising story in Jesus's life. So all these things together are making me curious about what is happening in us as individuals. And I'm going to talk about myself a little bit today and encourage you to think about yourself this week. How do these things coalesce? Our own personal history, our deep faith history, our country's history, and how we understand where we are today in loving one another. Because that is, at the end of the day, that's the key thing. Back in the Jewish tradition, we understood that very clearly, that, and this is what Jesus was born of. By the way, in the Jewish tradition, in Christianity, we just kind of talk about the Jewish tradition like it's just one thing. But that's not really right. At Jesus' time, there were 4 to 5 dominant factions of Judaism, different ways of thinking about what it meant to be Jewish. And some of those were very different than others, not that dissimilar from today's Christianity, where you have 4 or 5 dominant voices of Christianity that, in some extreme examples, they don't even seem like they're talking the same religion, right? Because their language is so different, their vision is so different. What they believe to be the most important things are so different. Well, that's how it was in Jesus' day. And so when we look at Jesus and see how he interpreted Scripture, it's important to realize those different voices, because most of the time he sides with one of those voices more than the other 3 or 4. And so that gives us a clue on the historical context of Jesus, what he's thinking about, and that needs to shape our eyes. But one thing you can definitely say is true about Judaism that formed Jesus was that more than anything else, they viewed God as a God who is known as loving and kind. From the creation story right out of the gate to how God worked with Adam and Eve when they blew it in the Garden of Eden, you see God as loving. When you look at the covenant with Abraham, even the story of Noah, that's a peculiar one. That's a Jewish myth that we can unpack at another time. Even in that story, God is one who wants to save, even as things are falling apart. Just remember that story was in contrast to other flood stories that floated around the world in that day and age. When you get to Abraham, it's God wanting a new covenant, a new way of doing things, which are evidenced by grace and love, where sacrifices still happen, but very differently and not to the same degree. It's a different kind of relationship that this Jewish nation was started with. And when God hears the voice of his people who are in slavery and sees them mistreated, it's God who comes to rescue them, because he's like, that is not okay in any circumstance. So as people developed, as the Jewish people understood who God was with them, and they ratified and codified what they believed about this God, this idea of God's love filtered all the way up to the top. And in fact, it dominated the way they thought about it. So, what is the number one commandment? Jesus was asked this, by the way, by kind of a know-it-all. What's the most important commandment? And Jesus said out of his mouth something that every Jewish person knew: "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength." So everybody was nodding their head like this. And then Jesus follows it up. He says, and there's a second one that's equally important. Equally important. And some scholars say they're almost exactly the same thing. Where Jesus says, okay, the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength. The second greatest commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. Later on in Jesus' life, actually it was not long before he would be arrested and killed, he said to the disciples, I have a new commandment for you. And that new commandment that he gave his disciples, both originally and evermore, was, I want you to love one another as I have loved you. The second half of that sentence is probably the more important part. The love one another piece, we can get on board with that because we want to do that. That's what we, deep in our heart of hearts, I believe that's what we aspire to be and do with our lives. And we have an idea of what love looks like, but that's why the second part of that verse, of that commandment, is so important. Jesus just didn't leave it at, hey, everybody, I want you to love one another, because we'd all be like, got it, nailing it, we're doing this so well. But Jesus follows it up with, I want you to love one another as I have loved you, because that changes our definition of what love looks like. This idea of loving one another stuck with the disciples. It shows up in other writings of later apostles. That's the same thing as disciples, just later on after Jesus was off the planet. And so you see Paul writing an entire chapter in his letter to the Corinthian church. We call it the love chapter, 1 Corinthians 13, if you want to look it up, where he talks about love, defines love, makes it clear what love is in its depths and fullness as best as he can. Later on, you see another apostle, John, in one of his letters to the churches. And we even made a camp song out of this. It's from 1 John chapter 4, verses 7 and 8. Beloved, let us love one another, for love is of God, and everyone who loveth is born of God and loveth God. He who loveth not knoweth not God, for God is love. Beloved, let us love one another, 1 John 4, 7 and 8. I'm not going to sing the song, but that's the verse in wonderful King James version. What's the point of that? The point is that they got it, that stuck with them. And so if we are claiming to be Jesus people, Jesus followers, then that needs to be really important. And yet we struggle with it. We like to say we want to do it, and sometimes we pat ourselves on the back for how well we've done it. But I think we need to understand that this is an ongoing journey to learn how to love one another as Jesus loved. It's easy to love the people that we love. It's easy for me to love my kids. They are, by far, the easiest people for me to love. They're my kids. From day one, they're my kids. I don't think there's anything they could do to make me not love them. That's just the way it is. And my wife, certainly very easy to love. Now, a little caveat on that. I deeply love my wife, no doubt about it. This year, we will celebrate 29 years of marriage. But the thing about married relationships is we fall in love with each other because we see the best of each other. And we love that about each other. But when you get married, you don't just see the best parts of each other. You see all of each other. And I feel so badly and sorry for my wife because she has seen the worst of me. Things I'm not proud of and wish I could change and hope to change. I hope I'm a much more mature, better person than I was 29 years ago. I think so. And I hope that 20 years from now, when we're celebrating almost 50 years or when we hit that milestone, I hope I am a much more mature person and deep person and more loving person than I am today. And I'm pretty confident that she hopes the same is true because that's married life. That's the way it is. That also takes us to the depths of love, though, is learning to love each other even though we see each other's worst stuff. And unfortunately, sometimes in marriage relationships, we reserve our worst stuff for those people that we love the most. My wife is an easy person for me to love. People I get along with, people who see the world like I do, easy people to love. But, as I've reflected on this stuff, especially in light of Black History Month and the racial reality tension that exists in our country, I have to be honest with you that for a good part of my life, for reasons I'm only now really beginning to appreciate, there were certain people that I struggled to have as easy a time loving. And I can't really explain why. Because largely for some people of color, I had a harder time feeling at ease with, comfortable with, which allows this kind of love to happen. I grew up in a very, very healthy family. Both Lynn and I were very lucky that way. We chose which family we were going to be born into very well. My family, my dad was a pastor. I went to church every weekend of my life unless I had a temperature over 102. That was my life story. And my parents, my dad, my parents were classic mainline in their theological perspective, which means they were not hate mongers. They were not judgmental in their language. I never heard much about hellfire and brimstone growing up, and heaven was not the carrot that got me into the faith. It was more like this is the Jesus way is the way of life that we are choosing to live. And that's how they modeled it. That's how they explained it. And that's how we generally lived. My parents were known for being very nice people. They're both still alive, and they're still known for being very nice people. Very good people, very generous people, very gracious people. My dad, in his professional life, I still come across people today who've known him forever. And pretty much across the board, anybody I meet that knew my dad in the day, they will say to me, everybody I know who knows your dad said they felt valued and cared for by him. Everybody. Well, that's wonderful. And that's what I aspire to be like too. Because I do. That's where I want to be. And yet I recognize that in my journey, people of color were kind of foreign to me. And I had kind of a resonant unease or discomfort. Particularly for African Americans, a little bit for Latinx, hardly any for Asian people of color. And I only realized in recent years why that is, which I'll unpack in the coming weeks. And the strange thing is, I grew up in a loving household that never spoke in overtly derogatory terms about people of color. Never. In fact, it was just the opposite. If I ever would have spoken in derogatory terms or used racial slurs, I tell you what, man, there would have been some consequences to that. That was not acceptable in my household. And so I've just been wrestling with this. What was it about it? And what was it like for me? It was just, I want people to like me. My personality type in particular struggles with that. And so when I would be around people of color, again, particularly African Americans, I would just be uncomfortable. I'd be like, I don't want to screw this up. I don't want to say the wrong thing. I want them to like me. I want them to know I'm okay and I'm cool and all that. And I knew enough about American history at that point to know that they got a raw deal, African Americans, because of slavery and all that. And it was difficult. And part of the reason why is because I grew up in a very, very white world. The school I went to, the church I grew up in, it wasn't segregated. There were people of different ethnicities in it, but it was still suburban Kansas City. And where I went to school was Overland Park, when it was just beginning to become a suburb, and it was very, very white. With a smattering of Asian people thrown in there and maybe some others, but not many African Americans. Very, very few. Later on, when I would go to high school, we moved up to Michigan, and I went to high school in a wealthy suburb of Lansing, Michigan called Okemos. And my high school for until my later years in high school were the best 6 years of my life. But the later years in high school, not really. Like maybe my junior, senior year, before that, there were just a couple African Americans in school. And that alone tells you something, because if you know anything about Michigan, Detroit, was, the center of R&B, right? And it's Motown, after all. So it's not like Michigan is short on people of color, but Okemos, except for mainly Asians and some Middle Eastern descent, hardly any African Americans in my school. And so they may as well have been from Mars. I had no exposure to people of color, really, except for Asians in my school. And the ones that we did have, I remember one kid in my class, his name was Sammy, and this was at the height of Michael Jackson's fame. That's what he was becoming. This is the Thriller era, and that. And Sammy, he was a dead ringer, man. Not only could he kind of pull off the look, really pull off the look of Michael Jackson, but he had the moves. Sammy was pretty cool. And then, there was a girl that I thought was really out of my league in my class that I kind of wanted to ask out, but I thought she was too smart and too cute. So I never dared. But that was kind of it. There weren't too many. In college, it got a little bit better, partly because even though where I got my bachelor's was in Kansas, it was pretty mixed, which was great. And I got a good friendship, and my friend Adolphus Lacey. And he and I were both knew that we were headed toward pastoral ministry someday, so we had great conversations. That helped a lot, just because I was exposed to people. When I went to a seminary, it just got even better, because I went to seminary in a suburb of Chicago, but it drew people from all over Chicago, and Chicago is incredibly diverse, and I benefited from that. Did you know that Jesus himself struggled similarly with this? That he also, was less comfortable with some people in contrast to others. Now, some of us don't like to hear this. Some of us want to think about Jesus as kind of like a jack-in-the-box. That Jesus, once God turned the crank enough in history, then all of a sudden, out jumps Jesus, and it's a Jesus in the box, or something like that. And when he comes out of the box, he's ready to go right out of the gate. No processing needed. He's perfect in every possible way, just like Mary Poppins, and just nails everything just right. And there's a whole theology that's built around that rendition of perfection and sinlessness and all that, which I take issue with. There's one particular passage which is incredibly uncomfortable for people who are able to see this for what it is. And this is kind of deep in Matthew's retelling of Jesus' life. It's not like this started in early chapters, but this is like more midway through his life, which I think is really important for us to understand. So Jesus, you need to know, grew up in kind of a backwater part of Israel. It was not the center of Jewish life. That would have been Jerusalem. That was the capital city. We're talking a day's journey north at least, maybe 2 days' journey north. And around the Sea of Galilee, which is, a place of commerce and fishing and all that. But where Jesus grew up, it was not highly educated, and people from the south in Jerusalem kind of looked down their nose at people from the north. And so people like the people leading Judaism would have looked down their nose at Jesus. So this context starts this way. Then Jesus left Galilee, which was the general region Jesus was from, and went north to the region of Tyre and Sidon. These two places, Tyre and Sidon, were thriving metropolises, which were nice and shiny, built with Roman Empire money. So this was where a lot of action was taking place, but not much Jewish action taking place. And it wasn't that far away. So he goes up to these areas. A Gentile woman who lived there came to him pleading, "Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David, for my daughter is possessed by a demon that torments her severely." So this is a non-Jewish woman from this nice shiny town, from the burbs, if you will. And she's coming up to Jesus, who, she might any other day look down her nose at, but she recognizes that Jesus has some fame for being a healer. And her daughter apparently has some kind of demon. Now, we don't know what that means. Some people take that very literally. I don't. I take that more as maybe she had some kind of a mental health kind of a thing, or maybe it was some kind of an imbalance in her brain chemicals or whatever. But whatever she was dealing with seemed to be a terrible threat, and she knew it. And so she's just looking for help because she doesn't have any other answers. So she hears about Jesus and goes, "My daughter's possessed by a demon that torments her severely." But Jesus gave her no reply, not even a word. The silent treatment. Our Jesus, our beloved Jesus, doesn't even pay attention to her. Then his disciples urged him to send her away. Oh my gosh. "Tell her to go away," they said. "She is bothering us with all her begging." Man, this does not sound like Jesus or the disciples at all. What happened to our love everybody, love your neighbor as yourself? Where'd that guy go? Then Jesus said to the woman, I was sent only to help God's lost sheep, the people of Israel. But she came and worshiped him, which is kind of a bowed down before him to pay him homage. That's what she's not like she breaks into song with Caleb or something. She's just simply showing him great respect and pleads with him, says, "Lord, help me." So she shows her heart of hearts here. And Jesus responded, "It isn't right to take food from the children and throw it to the dogs." Oh, cringe factor. She replied, "That's true, Lord, but even dogs are allowed to eat the scraps that fall beneath their master's table." She's playing along because she's desperate for her child to get helped. "Dear woman," Jesus said to her, "your faith is great. Your request is granted." And her daughter was instantly healed. This woman was more mature than Jesus out of her desperation. Now, there are some scholars who look at this, and you'll find this particularly in your evangelical study Bibles. Well, if you go down to the footnotes, they're going to talk about this, and the way they're going to frame this, because they have to keep Jesus as perfect in every possible way, they're going to frame this like when Jesus calls her a dog, that it's kind of with a twinkle in his eye and a little wink afterwards, like, "Oh, you dog," and call it good. And it's almost like he's laughing along the way, like he's just playing with this thing. Like, oh, I know what we're going to do, but let's just play the game. Like that's the tone of it. That he's joking around like we do, But I don't think that's accurate for a couple of reasons. One, historically, I'm a dog lover for sure. And so some people look at this and say, well, dogs are men's best friends. What better compliment can you give a person than calling them a dog? Let me tell you something. If I called my wife a dog, she would not take that as a compliment. If I called any people group dogs, I don't think they would take that as a compliment, even in an age where we spend a ridiculous amount of money on our pets. I don't think any people group anywhere would take that as, you just made my day. Thanks for calling me a dog. I so appreciate this. Let me write this down in my journal. I can't believe how nice Pete was today in calling me a dog. You get my drift here? There's no possible way. Now, more clear-eyed scholars who do not feel compelled to keep Jesus perfect in every way, but appreciate his humanity, his full humanity, and don't have to keep him sinless in the way that we have looked at this verse. They look at this differently, and they look at it with sobriety. And you know how they frame this? You know how they, just to give you the emotional weight of this, you know how they understand this? It would be as if today a white man, Jesus, went up and had the same conversation with a black person. And instead of calling them dogs, he would say, why would I do anything for you, you fill in the blank with the worst racial epithet we could have, or the worst word you can imagine. And I think you can imagine that. There is no way that person is going to feel anything but hated. There's no way they're going to feel anything but disdain in that comment. That's the power that I want you to hear this verse with. That Jesus said that. He dropped his version of the N-word in this setting. Now that might make you really uncomfortable. And it should. But the reality is that Jesus didn't stay there. We're all shaped by where we've grown up, who informed us and all this. And Jesus was so loving in his ministry, and he's known for that. And yet, kind of, my heritage, I was formed to be a loving, good person. And yet I also know that there are other factors in play in my upbringing that shaped my eyes, that created a discomfort in me, which I could not explain or articulate. And I think the same thing is true for Jesus. He grew up in a time where Israelites, Jewish people, just really loathed people who weren't Jewish because they'd been stepped on by those people for so long and were now under Roman oppression, and they weren't going to get out of it. It was awful. And so a very natural hatred grew in the way they viewed other people. And we see this evidence time and again, and I'll show those to you in the coming weeks. But I think in this one exchange that we see in a very, very unvarnished look of Jesus, we get a glimpse of two things. One, Jesus' humanity, but we also get a glimpse of how Jewish people felt about the other, people who were not like them, people with a different ethnicity, slightly different skin tone. I think that's what we're seeing here. Now, the great hopefulness that we also see here is that Jesus didn't stay there. I think this was probably a pivotal moment for Jesus. I think it was a pivotal moment for the disciples. Otherwise, the story wouldn't have made the cut. They could have dropped this story, but they kept it because they remembered it, because it was so important. because it marked a change, a sea change in Jesus, which then would cause the disciples, anybody who says they're following Jesus, to consider the same for themselves. Jesus evolved. Jesus progressed in his maturity. Her faith changed his eyes. Her passion and desperation caused him to mature. Her capacity to see beyond ethnicity and skin tones helped soften his eyes similarly. How were you formed? Were you raised by people like I was? Raised to be good people? What was their language like as you grew up? Were there derogatory terms? Was that part of the mix? You know, in my family, I've just only recently thought about this, and I love my family and I so respect my parents. I'm so grateful for the life that they afforded me in so many ways. My parents never uttered a racial slur, common slurs that you might hear, and it was not tolerated in my house. And yet, I'm also very aware that we never, ever really talked about it either. We never talked about any racial stuff whatsoever, even though it was all around us. And sometimes I think that in and of itself, in fact, I'm confident of it, perpetuates the problem that we have. Because I grew up in a very white household, in a very white world. And for white people, it's not the problem. It's not a problem. It's not an issue. But for our faith, it matters. For our faith, it compels us to love one another as Jesus loved. That means that if we're really going to follow Jesus, we got to take this stuff seriously. And we have a higher calling here. It is a calling that goes back to the origins of Judaism that clearly informed Jesus, that caused him to mature beyond binary thinking in his day and age. And in his maturation, in his development of understanding who he was, who God is, and how then we are to treat all other people, it meant he had to grow. And if Jesus had to grow, if he had to come to grips with all the shaping forces that shaped his eyes, and we call ourselves followers of Jesus, that's part of the following. So as we go through this month, I'm hoping that it will be a really important journey for us to take a look at our individual stories, to take a look at our very local stories in Napa, California, to take a look at larger scale stuff going on in our nation, and then talking about where this might take us. By the way, fun little thing's going to happen at the end of February. It's the Jewish festival of Purim. And this had to do with racial prejudice and genocide. And we're going to celebrate that day. So that's coming. But for right now, I just hope you'll take the journey with me. I hope that you'll allow Jesus to be fully human and recognize that he struggled with this stuff and he overcame it. And as Jesus followers, we're invited to do the same. So, going to give you just a moment, going to give you a song to kind of warm things up, to remind you of the love of God. And then we'll be back to take communion and say the Lord's Prayer together. See you in a few.
We all start on the outside looking in. It's where grace begins. The shape that we were in, and just when all hope seemed lost, love opened the door for us. He said, "Come emperors and the princes. All who fail, you've been forgiven. All who dream, all who suffer. All who loved and lost another. All the chained and all the free. All who follow, all who lead. Anyone who's been let down or lost, you have been found. All who have been labeled right or wrong. To everyone who hears this song, he said, come to the table. Come join the sinners who've been redeemed. Take your place beside the Savior. Sit down and be set free. Sit down and be set free. Come to the table. Come to the table. Come to the table.
Yeah, I have a friend in town. He's a retired pastor, man of great wisdom who I respect much. And he and I had a conversation a few years ago about communion. And he likes to theobabble with me because he knows I'm on the emerging side of Christianity, and he toys with some of this stuff. And I'm a safe person to talk about tough questions and challenging stuff and all that. And so we were talking about communion one day, and he said, Pete, I think the most important thing that we need to remember with communion is that Jesus just simply said, do this in remembrance of me. Remember me. Remember my life. Remember what I taught. And so beyond forgiveness of sins and substitutionary atonement, which is how most people today think about communion, I just want you to think about this bread and the cup as a way to remember who Jesus was and his life and his teachings and a decision to follow. And so you have this bread which he took and said, when you eat this bread, remember me, remember my body, my broken body. And that was a way to say to us, remember that this thing is flesh and blood. This thing is hard to do. You're going to take a beating on this thing. It's not easy. And his life certainly resulted in suffering for doing it a different way, as a different way of life, a way of nonviolence, a way of speaking into authority and challenging and holding power accountable in ways that cost him physically. It is uncomfortable at times. And so we remember that about Jesus. Remember that as Jesus followers, the same should be true with us. So take and eat. And remember the cup. He said, when you take this cup, remember, this is a new covenant of our loving each other. I want you to remember me in the cup. Of course, shed blood, that kind of harkens back to what I just said about, there's not only skin in the game, but sometimes there's bloodshed at times, metaphorically, and for Jesus, very, very physically and literally. But for us, it's also a reminder that, Jesus had something coursing through his veins that caused him to do and be everything that Jesus was. And so for us to take the cup, I just encourage you to remember that Jesus was a man whose heart was so after God that was the most important thing, even when it made him very uncomfortable, and he made other people very uncomfortable. When he had this exchange with the Syrophoenician woman that we looked at, and had to grow because this woman who was not Jewish pushed back on him, which made him take a look at himself, uncomfortable. And yet it pinged something in his heart that said, I need to take a look at this. And it changed him. It changed him, and it changed his followers so that they were more open than anybody ever would have imagined them to be, because they kept taking this cup, they kept remembering Jesus. Jesus followers, remember Jesus. Remember the blood that coursed through his veins, that courses through ours. Take and drink. As we conclude today, like we often do, I want to end with the Lord's Prayer, which is an opportunity for us to renew, to re-engage, re-sign with Jesus, to recognize that his way is a way we want to follow. It is a way of well-being, of health, peace with God, peace with ourselves, peace with all people, a peace that is rooted in the word shalom, which is this deep harmony, well-being for us and absolutely everybody. And we recognize we're a part of something bigger, that we want something bigger to happen in our lives and in our world than what we can come up with. But we want God to speak to us and speak to our world. That we trust that God will deliver on that. We don't want to be judgmental people. We want to be graceful people, forgiving people. We don't want to fall into the path that leads us astray, but we want to stay on the path that is going to lead to justice and peace for everybody. This is a deeply, deeply Christian, Jewish, spiritual truth that we all want. And it's rooted in this belief that there is this greater other that we call God, that is our ground of being, that is the very spirit that gives everything life, that brought creation to being and continues to create at an accelerating rate and calls it all good. This is who we are. So let's renew our covenant with this God using the prayer that Jesus taught us to pray. Say it with me now. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. Have a great week.